And so next week, he'll jump back into part 2. We are going to stay in Genesis, though, but we're going to go to the very end of the book. So if you will go to Genesis 37, that is where we'll be tonight. And we're going to be talking about the life and the story of Joseph. And we're just going to be kind of hitting high points. There's a lot to cover there. Like I said, I said 17 chapters. It's actually 13 chapters. So there's 13 chapters there. We're going to read a lot of the beginning, and then we're going to I'll kind of story the rest of it. But there's a lot of amazing nuggets. This is one of my favorite stories in all of Scripture, just because it speaks so highly of what it means to be a follower of God and being faithful in the midst of the trials and the circumstances and the things of your life. And so if you've ever gone through any difficulty, if you've ever gone through anything that the circumstances around you seem like just horrible and you don't think you're ever going to make it through, go back, read the story of Joseph. It's pretty incredible. And so if you're there, we'll pick up in Genesis chapter 37. Jonathan, I guess you're doing it all tonight. So if you're there, Genesis 37, that's where we're going to pick up. And so to kind of give you a heads up of what's going on, Joseph is one of 12 sons of Jacob, okay? And Joseph is the first son of Jacob's favorite wife, which is Rachel. Favorite wife, you said? Yeah, he had 2. If you don't remember that story, go back and read that. Basically, Joseph goes to work for his uncle Laban, and he says, I want to marry Rachel. I like her. She's pretty. And Laban says, all right, we can do that. Work for me for 7 years. Joseph works for 7 years. Wedding night, she's veiled. They go in. It's dark. He wakes up the next morning, and it's Leah, not Rachel. They pulled a switcheroo on him. And so he has to work for 7 more years, marries Rachel. And so Joseph has had 10 kids up until this point, and then Jacob has had 10 kids, then he has Joseph, and he's the first one of Rachel, his favorite wife, and so Joseph becomes his favorite son because it's the first son of his favorite wife. And he gets special treatment. You know the story of the coat of many colors. That's Joseph that we're talking about here. And so we pick up in chapter 37, and we see that Joseph is a man who loves his father and wants to do right by his father. And in the first part of 37, he just dreamed this dream, okay? So he has this dream, and in the dream, he sees all these different things, and he interprets it as, hey, one day, my brothers and my father, they're going to bow down before me, right? Now, if you are the younger brother and you go to your older brothers, I don't know this because I was an only child, but so say Jackie, when she grows up, she goes to her older sisters and says, hey, you guys are going to bow down to me one day, right? I don't see Willa and Cece buying that, or Isla, or Everly, or Rowan, like any of them, right? But that's essentially what Joseph does. He goes and he tells them this dream that he has, and that one day you guys are going to bow down to me. And so the brothers don't like it. They don't like it. He's already had this coat of many colors. They don't like that. And then he has these dreams. And so let's pick up in verse 18 and see what's happening. And so real quick before we do that, before we read verse 18, so Jacob sends Joseph to go out and to check on his brothers, okay? And the very first part of that, chapter 37, we also see that basically Joseph is in charge of 4 of his older brothers. They are watching this flock, and Joseph has already reported that, Dad, they're lazy, they're not doing their job, right? So we see that Joseph's a hard worker. He's already calling out his brothers for being lazy, not doing the work. And so we pick up in verse 18, and Joseph is being sent again to his brothers, and it says in verse 18, they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. Well, that seems like a stretch, right? These are his brothers after all, and here they are. They want to kill this guy. So verse 19, they said to one another, here comes this dreamer, right? They're throwing that out sarcastically. Here comes this dreamer. We're going to shut his dreams down. It's sarcasm. And so they're in their mind, they're thinking, all right, if we can take out the dreamer, then we can take out the dream, right? If we can crush him, then we will never bow down to him because he doesn't exist anymore. So we can solve this problem right here, right now. They hated his dreams, and they hated his status. They hated the fact that he was the favorite son, right? And that he had already called out his brothers for being lazy. They didn't like it. They were the older brothers. They wanted to be the ones leading the charge. They wanted the leadership. They wanted the status. They wanted people to look up to them. So they decided in this moment they were going to crush this dream. And so here's what they say. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of this dreamer. But when what will become of his dream? But when Reuben heard it, Reuben is which son? Do you know? He's the oldest, right? So he's the oldest one. He's the firstborn, so he steps up, right? So Reuben heard it. He rescued him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. All right, Reuben's got his back. I'm the older brother. Come on, guys. Like, I know he can be a pain. I know he's got these dreams, but, like, he's our brother. We can't kill him. So Reuben steps in. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him. And in his mind, right, so this is one of those, like, asides in the book that it tells us here, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So Reuben's got his own plan in the midst of this big plan. So the brother's plan is to take Joseph, to throw him into a pit, and to kill him, right? And so Reuben says, no, let's not do that. Let's put him in the pit, and then I'm going to come back later and rescue him when they're not looking. And so the first thing we see here is that given the opportunity to do the right thing, Reuben does like half of the right thing, right? He keeps them from killing his brother, but he doesn't step up and say, listen, we don't need to do anything to him, right? Let God handle it. Let God do the right thing. Instead, he tries to go behind his brother's back because he wants to save face with them. He wants to appease them and make him think they're doing something good or that they would want, but yet he's going to come rescue him later so that, in turn, he can look good in front of his dad, right? Joseph is the favored kid, and so Reuben's like, if I save the favored kid and I bring him back and restore him to Jacob, then that'll make me more responsible. Dad will trust me more, right? Because I'm doing the right thing. I'm going to basically take my status back as the firstborn. It's kind of Reuben's thinking here, I think. And so Reuben said, that's Reuben's plan, verse 23. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and they threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Okay, so Joseph is taken. He's thrown into this pit. And there's no water in it. And so we see Reuben comes, and he tries to do the right thing. They strip him of his robe. That's his status, right? So they're basically taking everything from him. They're going to put him in the pit. They're stripping him of his status. They're putting him in his place. Who is this guy that he would come to me and tell me that we're going to bow down to him, right? This is kind of their thing, right? They don't like this. And so Joseph, in this moment, I don't know what he's thinking. I'm sure he's distraught. I'm sure he's angry. I'm sure he's frustrated. But we don't get his point of view here. We just see what his brothers do. And then verse 25 just really kind of sets the tone for how his brothers really feel about him. So they've plotted to kill him. They've thrown him in this pit. And what do? Like, what's the next best thing that you would do if this was you in this situation? Verse 25. Then they sat down to eat. What? They've just plotted to kill their brother. They've put him in a pit, and then they go, you know what, we're hungry. That was a lot of work. Let's sit down and eat. You know, most scholars probably think that the food actually came from Joseph, that Jacob sent Joseph with food to his brothers to provide for them, to bring them nourishment, because they're out watching the flocks, they're taking care, they're doing those things. And so after they've plotted to kill Joseph, they sit down and they eat. This shows their indifference. This shows their lack of care for their brother, their hardness of heart. So we've got them showing indifference. We got Reuben showing a little bit of mercy, but it's probably to make himself look better in the eyes of his father. So let's keep going. And looking up while they're eating, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. So they go, okay, maybe let's not kill him, because what do we win from that? But if we can sell him, then we can make some money. So they decide on a different plan, but look at how verse 27 is worded. It says, come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. You have like a dichotomy here, a juxtaposition in this verse, where his brothers on one hand are like, he's our brother. We don't need to kill him, but we're still going to sell him into slavery. So it's like they have this, this compassion, but also they don't care, right, in one hand or the other. So they have a mixture of morality and immorality, a mixture of conviction and conformity. So they are a little bit convicted because he's their brother, but they still want something out of it. They don't want to have to deal with them anymore. So they decide that they're going to sell him to this band of traders that are coming through. And his brothers listen to him. So Judah comes up with this plan. He pitches it to his brothers, and it says his brothers listen to him. And then it says in verse 28, then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up, lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Now, if you notice here, there's two different groups of people that it seems to be happening here. There's the Ishmaelites and there's the Midianites. These are probably the same groups of people because the Ishmaelites were from Midian. So the author here, Moses, is probably just using those two interchangeably. And so they're the Ishmaelites, they're from Midian. And so if you're wondering why those two are different there, that's probably why. And they sell him for 20 shekels of silver, right? For 20 shekels of silver. Now, in the Hammurabi Code, which is a Babylonian legal text, 20 shekels was about the cost of an average slave. So that's where this number comes from. It's not just some random number. They didn't bargain for it. This is what you would pay for a basic slave, according to the Babylonian legal text, the Hammurabi Code. So they sell him off. He goes to Egypt. Let's pick up in verse 29. So when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. So Reuben, we don't know where he went, right? It doesn't say that he left. It just says they sat down to eat. It doesn't say that Reuben left. So maybe there was an issue with the sheep. Maybe their issue was an issue with the herd. And so Reuben stepped off to deal with that. And while he was gone, Judah decides they concoct this plan to sell him. And so Reuben comes back to rescue him out of the pit, and he's gone. So he's upset. He's mad. He tears his clothes in anguish. It says, and he returned to his brothers and said, the boy is gone, and where shall I go? Right? I'm the firstborn. I should have been responsible. I should have done the right thing, but I didn't. So where should I go? So in verse 31, then they took Joseph's robe, they slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the blood, and they sent the robe of many colors, and brought it to their father and said, this we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. And he identified it and said, it is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments, put on sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So let's pause here for just a minute before we jump into chapter 39 and talk about the fact that in the midst of Joseph's trial, in the midst of being in the pit, he has to trust God, right? He has to trust that God is in control. God has sent him this dream, and we're going to see that he knows this later, but God has sent him this dream where his brothers and his father will one day bow to him. He knows that he has an important part to play in the role of the nation of Israel, and so he has to trust God in the midst of being in a difficult circumstance. And so I think for us, we need to do the same thing, right? A lot of us in life will be faced in these difficult circumstances, and we got to learn to trust God in the midst of the pit. And so when Joseph's brothers, on the other hand, don't have any trust, right? They don't trust Joseph. They don't trust their father. They don't trust them to make the right decisions. And so when you have a lack of trust, you cover it with lies and you cover it with deceit. And so in order for Joseph's brothers to cover that up, they concoct this big plan that we're going to sell Joseph off, but we're going to make it look like he's dead, right? We're going to leave our father with no hope so that he will turn and give blessing to us instead of Joseph because he's going to think that Joseph is dead, right? So they dip it in blood, they take it to Jacob, and they said, Joseph is dead. Now, one thing about Jacob here is Jacob knows God's promises. Jacob knows that God has promised to do something amazing through his family, and yet when they bring him the cloak, he assumes that what they're telling him is true. he forgets in this moment about the promises of God. And he says, basically, I'm going to mourn to death. I'm going to mourn myself to Sheol, is what he says. And so Jacob, in verse 34, right, where he says he tore his garments, puts on sackcloth on his loins, and mourns his son for days, he's forgotten about the promise of God. And you and I, when we're faced with difficulty, when we're faced with hardship, when we're faced with horrible things in our life, the one thing we cannot do is forget about the promises of God. Because what we're going to see in the life of Joseph is he doesn't forget that, and that is what gets him through all the difficulties that he faces in his life. So just like Joseph, you and I have to trust God in the pit. Now, 38 doesn't deal with Joseph. It deals with his brother Judah, and horrible story. We'll pick up a piece of that in just a second, but let's fast forward to Genesis 39. So Joseph is sold into slavery. He's brought to Egypt, verse 1 in chapter 39. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. Verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. Notice here it says the Lord was with Joseph. It is, when God is with you, it's not based on your location. It's based on your attitude. So even though Joseph had left the land of his fathers, right, the promised land, the land that he was supposed to be in, and gone somewhere else, God did not abandon him. God was still with him. God went with Joseph. He was always with him. Even though Joseph had been betrayed, he had been abandoned, he had been sold by his family, God was still with him. So like no matter what we go through, no matter how our blood may treat us or friends or coworkers or anything like that, God is always with us if we are faithful and we trust in him. He's always with us. So we don't have any fear, right? Hebrews 13, 5 and 6 says, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you. It's talking about God. God says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Right? We don't have to worry about what man can do because God is with us. So God is with Joseph. Pick up in verse 3. His master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So here we've got a pagan, someone who doesn't know God, who doesn't worship God, and he looks at the life of Joseph. He sees that he's successful, and it says that his master saw that the Lord was with him. Like Potiphar noticed something different about Joseph. He noticed that he was a guy of character, a guy who was a leader, a man who, despite his circumstances, still had a positive attitude and outlook on life. And Potiphar's like, I like that. I like what you're doing. I'm gonna promote you. And so how can someone like us as a believer look like this to someone who's not, right? Well, Colossians 3:23 says, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, right? Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. This is what Joseph is doing. He's working heartily for God no matter what his circumstances are. And so Potiphar sees that and he promotes him. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house, put him in charge of all that he had. And from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. And because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. So Joseph has proven himself. Potiphar says, you know what? I give you charge over everything I have. Now, one thing we know about Potiphar, it says that he's the captain of the guard. So that means he is the captain over all of Pharaoh's army. He is like the head of the Secret Service, right? He's the one who oversees all of the things that happen. He's the one who watches out for Pharaoh, who watches out for his back, who handles anything that the bodyguard would handle, executions, punishments. So Potiphar is the main guy, and he trusts Joseph with everything that he has. That's important because we're going to see why in just a minute. And so Potiphar sees God's hand on Joseph. He trusted Joseph with everything. He saw that he was a hard worker, which was the opposite of his brothers, right? The whole problem that we had in the beginning in 37 was that His brothers were not working hard when Joseph was, and here his hard work pays off. He gets promoted. And as with anything in life, when it looks like things are going well, that's usually when the enemy chooses to strike. That's usually when temptation comes. It's often at the times of blessing, not adversity, when we face the severest of temptation. And that's what happens in the life of Joseph. Here he is. He's been sold into slavery, but he works hard, gets promoted. He gets put up in the house of Potiphar. Everything's put in his charge. And then at the end of verse 6, it says, now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. He's a good-looking dude, right? Good-looking dude. Verse 7, and after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me, okay? Potiphar is a hard worker. He's away from the house a lot. He is not giving his wife attention. She sees Joseph, this young man who's in her house. He's a good leader. He's a solid dude. He looks good. She says, I want you to come and I want you to sleep with me. Temptation always comes to attack your character when you're trying to do the right thing and follow the Lord. So we have to resist that temptation. We have to resist that. And this is a contrast here because here's what we're going to see. Verse 8, but Joseph, he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So Joseph talks about Potiphar, how Potiphar has trusted him with everything except for being able to sleep with Potiphar's wife. But Joseph very quickly says, no, I'm not going to do that. Now, this is a direct contrast to two of his brothers who did the opposite and gave in to temptation. If you go back earlier in Genesis, you'll read that Joseph's oldest brother, Reuben, right, we talked about him earlier, the firstborn, slept with his father's concubine. So he went out of his way, he gave into temptation, and he slept with someone who was not his wife. He slept with his father's concubine. And then the story that we didn't read in between Genesis 37 and 39 is the story of Judah and Tamar. And in that story, Judah gets caught up in a moment. He falls into temptation and winds up sleeping with this lady who's not married to. He doesn't know who she is, and then later finds out it's actually his daughter-in-law. Yeah, if you want weird stories, read the Old Testament, okay? It's full of them. And so it's a direct contrast here that Joseph says no, he's not like his brothers. He's not like Judah, and he's not like Reuben. He doesn't give in to temptation. He refuses, right? And ultimately, he points not to Potiphar, but to God. He said, I can't do this because if I give in, I'm not only sinning against my master here, but I'm sinning against my master in heaven. I'm sinning against God, ultimately, if I give in to temptation. And so, verse 10, pick back up there. And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, this woman is persistent, okay? Temptation in your life and in my life is persistent. It takes no days off. The New Testament tells us that the enemy is like a roaring lion prowling around seeking to devour us. And this is what this woman is doing. She is constantly in Joseph's ear every day, tempting him. It says day after day. She spoke to Joseph, and he would not listen to her. He would not lie beside her or to be with her, right? So day after day, he chooses not to listen. He chooses not to lie with her or to even go in the same room with her, right? He puts up boundaries. If you don't put boundaries in your life, when temptation comes, you will give in. There's no ands, ifs, or buts about it. If you don't have boundaries in your life, when temptation comes, you will give in. I do a lot of weddings for people. And the more and more I do them now, especially for younger couples, I talk to them about saving themselves for marriage. And a lot of times in those cases, they're already living together. They're already sleeping together. And so I always encourage them, like, don't do that, right? That's not what Scripture teaches. Scripture teaches that sex is a good thing, but it's designed to be between a man and a woman who are married. And so even if you know you're getting married, you're engaged, like, let's just keep it off the table because you don't want to open yourselves up to any sort of temptation. You've got to have boundaries. And if you don't have those, then you're going to give into temptation. Right? When I work with students, I told students, like, Especially guys are like, man, I'm struggling with lust. I don't know what to do. Well, how are you with your girlfriend? Well, we sat in the dark car for like 2 hours. Are you asking for stuff to happen? Like, don't put yourself in that situation, because I guarantee you, if you're sitting on your parents' couch with them in the same room, that's not going to happen, right? Don't put yourselves in those situations. You've got to put boundaries. And so Joseph puts up boundaries. He doesn't listen to her. He doesn't lie beside her, or he chooses not to be with her. But one day, it all comes to a head. Verse 11, but one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she called him by his garment, saying, lie with me. Now, I don't know in this situation if she planned this, because she's been in his ear every day to lie with him. If she, knew Joseph was coming that day, I'm sure he had a routine, and she sent everybody out of the house. The scripture doesn't tell us that. But I could see that happening the way this plays out, because she knew that Joseph was not going to give in. And so she sends everybody out of the house and says, all right, I'm going to make sure that nobody's here so I can catch him alone. So Joseph comes in. She's alone. There's nobody else there. She catches him by his garment and says, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. Joseph knew, you got to remember, okay, Joseph is a young man, right? He is a young man. There is part of him that wants to give in to this temptation. Let's admit that here. There's a part of him that wants to give in to this temptation. Our understanding up until this point, he's probably not had sex before. He's probably not lain with a woman. He probably wants to, but he chooses in this moment to run away. He leaves his jacket, leaves his coat, and bolts, right? And so he gets out of the way. He left his garment, verse 13, and as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, see, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Okay? So Potiphar's wife now is mad. I had this plan. He's ruined it, but I'm going to get him, right? I've got his jacket. I've got proof here. And so here we have a parallel back to Genesis 37, where his brothers had his jacket. They dipped it in the blood, and they took it to the father. Here, Potiphar's wife has his jacket, and she uses it against him, just like his brothers did. And look what she does. She brings this accusation against Joseph, and she points out three things. Here's what she points out. Number one, she blames Potiphar. Verse 14. See, he has brought in, right? Potiphar, my husband, he brought this guy in. It was his fault. So she blames Potiphar. Then she exploits racial tension. He brought this guy in, this Hebrew, to laugh at us. So there's a racial tension here between Joseph, who was a Hebrew, and the Egyptians, and she exploits that and said, not only has Potiphar brought somebody in here to work that's not you, it's a Hebrew, and he's put him above all you. All you Egyptians who are working in the house, Joseph is over you. How does that make you feel? So she's working this plan that she's got here. And then she says that he's coming here to laugh at us. He's mocking us. He thinks he's better than us. And she begins to twist these words in order to get people on her side. She's plotting against Joseph. She's making a power play. She's got the garment. She's using it for deception. And she's blaming her husband. She's blaming his race. And she's blaming Joseph. Verse 19. Or verse 16. And then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me, but as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me. His anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. So here's Joseph trying to do the right thing, and once again gets thrown into a pit of sorts, right? First one was an actual pit. Here it's prison. And so here's Joseph. He's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to trust the Lord. He's trying to follow God, and he's repeatedly just treated horribly. Now, Potiphar knew the kind of man that Joseph was. Obviously, he knew who he was, or he would have never trusted him with the entire house. But in this moment, verse 19, it says his anger was kindled, right? It burned like a fire. It blew away all that stuff that he knew to be true about Joseph. And not once did he ever ask for Joseph's side of the story, right? He just assumes what his wife says is true, despite Joseph's character, despite his integrity, despite what he's already proven, and he throws him into prison. In verse 21, it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed." God was still with Joseph, right? Even in the midst of all this stuff, even though everybody's abandoned him, God was still with Joseph. He grants favor with the warden of the prison. And what we see is that Joseph has integrity under pressure. He has integrity under pressure. So when you and I are put into situations and we have to make the right choice, we have to make the right decision, what do we do? What do we do when we're squeezed? What is the decision that we make? Are we going to trust God, or are we going to give in to temptation? Others see what we do, and God does too. And the warden saw that Joseph was a good man who worked hard, and he puts him in charge. And so Joseph, even in the midst of a terrible situation, he has integrity under pressure. Now let's look at chapter 40. Patience in the prison. So sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king and of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. Okay, so sometime later, at this point, Joseph is probably in his 20s, late 20s. He was 17 in chapter 37, and now he's probably in his late 20s. Okay, so a lot of years have passed. He's worked hard. He's tried to do the right thing. And here we have a divine appointment. Okay, it just so happens, as we see elsewhere in Scripture, right, that the cupbearer of the king and the baker committed offense, and they get basically thrown into prison. Pharaoh was angry with them. He puts them in custody in the house of the captain of guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with him, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. So God doesn't always come in ways that we expect, right? For Joseph, what we're going to see the next step in his life is there are two men who are thrown into prison, and God does that providentially, and we'll see that in a minute. And so God doesn't always come in ways we expect. Think about Moses, right? How did God come to Moses? Burning bush, right? God came to Jacob at Bethel. God came to Saul when he became king. Do you know what he was doing? He was out looking for his dad's lost donkeys, and God comes to him. What about Gideon? In the midst of the war, where's Gideon when the angel of the Lord comes and calls Gideon? He is in the bottom of the threshing floor hiding, and the angel comes to him and says, "Oh, great mighty warrior," right? And he's hiding. What about David? David is feeding sheep, right? God comes through the form of Samuel. Samuel goes through all of David's brothers, and David's out tending sheep when God comes to him. And so here we have a cupbearer and a baker, and they are thrown into prison. This is how God's going to take Joseph's next step. So these guys, they're over Pharaoh's food, and they're over Pharaoh's drink. Now, it does not tell us why they came into prison. It does not tell us why they're there, why Pharaoh got mad. Maybe they had plotted to poison Pharaoh. Maybe they were just terrible at their job. We don't really know. But they had a very important job. Their job was to make sure that the king didn't die from what he drank and that the king had good food to eat. That's their job. And I read somewhere there were like 37 different kinds of bread and like 50-something different recipes that the baker would have to use throughout the course of the year for different activities and things they would have to do. So the baker had to be really good at his job. And so he's thrown into prison. And then look at what it says, because this is the first time I've ever picked up on this. I don't know why I didn't see this before. But in verse 4, it says, the captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them. Now, who's the captain of the guard? Do you remember? Potiphar. That's the same man who threw him into prison, right? And so Potiphar, the same man who threw him into prison because he had tried to sleep with his wife, or so he thought, appoints Joseph to attend to these two men. So two things either happen here. Potiphar realized after he got so angry that Joseph was probably in the right and his wife was wrong, but he's trying to save face, so he's keeping him in prison. And so while he's in prison, though, he still appoints him to do things as a leader because Potiphar knows that he can trust him. So Potiphar still is appointing Joseph to do things, even though Joseph has been thrown into prison by Potiphar. And so Joseph is still trying to do good. He's still being a good leader despite all of these horrible circumstances that he's been through. And then what happens? Well, they have dreams, okay? So they have dreams. Joseph is really good at dreams, right? Remember, he's the dreamer. He's the one who dreamed that his brothers were going to bow down to him. And so the cupbearer and the baker, they both have dreams, and they tell them to Joseph. Now, one of them has a good dream, one of them not so good. And so let's look at verse 9. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and I pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." And then Joseph said to him, this is his interpretation. "The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head, restore to you your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as you did formerly as his cupbearer." And then Joseph adds this caveat, "Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, so to get me out of this house," right? I did this favor for you. I interpreted this dream. You're going to go back to Pharaoh. I want you to remember me when the time comes so I can get out of jail. Like, I want to be out of here. Like, I still want to do good. I want to be out of here. Now, the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, verse 16. He said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. This one not so good. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you." That's not what you want to hear, right? You ever have a weird dream, and like you go to somebody like, "What does this mean?" And they're like, "That means your head's going to get cut off." That's not good. And so Joseph interprets these dreams. He wants the chief cupbearer to remember him. And so they both go back to Pharaoh. The chief baker is hung. Verse 23 at the end of chapter 40. Yet the chief cupbearer, guess what he did? He didn't remember Joseph, but forgot him. He got back in his position. He got back in his power. He got back in his status, and he was only concerned about himself, and he forgets about Joseph. Here again, we have somebody else forgetting about Joseph. But guess who doesn't forget about Joseph? God. God doesn't forget about Joseph. And so even in the midst of being in prison, Joseph still has patience. Despite his kindness and his patience towards men, he is still forgotten, but God still remembers him. So far we've had that Joseph trusted God in the pit. He had integrity under pressure. He had patience in the prison. And the last thing that we see that Joseph has is Joseph has humility in power. In verse 41, or chapter 41 rather, we see that now a time has passed, 2 whole years have passed, so Joseph is about 30 at this point, and guess who has a dream? Pharaoh. Pharaoh has a dream. And then all of a sudden, guess what the cupbearer remembers? Oh my gosh, there was this guy in prison. He was really good at interpreting dreams. Now, one thing you need to know about the Egyptians were that they had sorcerers, they had magicians, which were different than like our magicians. So our magicians are just illusionists who trick us in thinking they're doing something when they're really not. Sleight of hand, that kind of thing. This day and age, you had these sorcerers, these magicians who manipulated the spiritual realm to make things happen, right? Whether that was demonic or whatever it was. And so there were a lot of times that they would interpret dreams. So when the cupbearer and the baker were in prison, they didn't have access to these guys, so they had to let Joseph interpret. And for some reason in 41, these guys can't interpret Pharaoh's dreams, right? Pharaoh has a dreams, he brings them in, they're like, we don't know what this means. And then the cupbearer goes, let's go call Joseph. I know this guy, he helped me out. He prophesied to me, Pharaoh, that you were going to put me back in and that you were going to hang the baker. I know he's good for it. Let's bring him in. So Pharaoh dreams, the cupbearer remembers, Joseph interprets. So verse 14, he's brought out of the pit. So finally, Joseph is coming out of the pit again. It's a parallel to chapter 37, verse 28, when he was put in the pit and sold into slavery. But this time, the pit is not for his to be sold into slavery, but it's actually for him to have a promotion. Verse 14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. They quickly brought him out of the pit, and when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. You had to be presented well when you came into the presence of Pharaoh. So Joseph is cleaned up, he's shaved, he's looking good. He comes in to Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells him his dream, and guess what Joseph does? He interprets it. Right? It's this dream that there are 7 skinny cows, there's 7 fat cows, they're there for 7 years, and then there's 7 skinny cows, and they come out of the water and they eat these 7 fat cows. That sounds really weird. What does it mean? Well, so Joseph says there's going to be 7 years where we have plenty of food in Egypt. We have over an abundance of food. And then there's going to be 7 years when we have famine. So I propose that we store up grain during the 7 years of plenty so that during the 7 years of famine, we've got plenty. So Pharaoh goes, I like this guy. Not only is he an interpreter of dreams, but he's got a plan, and we need to put it into place. And so Pharaoh promotes him. And so verse 25, we see that Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one, he tells him what they are. And then verse 37, this proposal, what he said, preserving the food during the time of plenty, pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Once again, because of Joseph's character, because of his integrity, because of him being willing to follow God and to be faithful, they see the power of God in his life. Even Pharaoh, there's something about this dude that's different. They can sense the Spirit of God in his life. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne, I will be greater than you. And he said to Pharaoh, see, I have set you over all of the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand. He put it in Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain on his neck and made him ride in a second chariot. And they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all of the land of Egypt. He makes him the grand vizier, which is like the prime minister of all of Egypt. So Joseph is in charge of everything, over everything, except for Pharaoh himself. So it's like Potiphar's house, except now it's the whole country of Egypt. And Joseph is in charge. Now, that's important because in chapter 42, what we see is that the 7 years of plenty have gone, famine has come. Back in Israel, where Joseph's brothers are, they're hungry. They're starving. They need food. And so Joseph's father Jacob says, I want you guys to load up, I want you to go to Egypt, and I want you to get some food. And so in chapter 42, we see that Joseph's brothers go to Egypt. It's been 20 years since they saw their brother. Okay? A lot has changed. They don't recognize him. So they get there. We see that they get there, they come in. Joseph realizes it's them, but they don't recognize him. And so Joseph begins to kind of mess with them a little bit. He sees his brothers, they recognize him, but they don't remember him. And he calls them spies. He's like, you guys are spies. You've come to take from us, like you're spies from Israel. And they kind of back up. They're like, no, we're good, we're not spies. We just came to get food. And so Joseph begins to ask him questions. He wants to know about his brothers, but he's trying to be discreet about it. And so they offer up. We're your servants. We're 12 brothers. The son of one is in the land of Canaan, and behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more. That's Joseph. But Joseph said to them, it is as I said to you, you are spies. By this you shall be tested, by the life of Pharaoh. You shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Right? He wants to see Benjamin because Benjamin is his only full brother. So Rachel had 2 sons. She had Joseph and she had Benjamin. Joseph wants Benjamin to be there, and he's not there. And so he wants them to bring Benjamin back. So he says, you can't come back here without Benjamin. I'm going to keep Simeon with me. You can go back to your father, and I'll give you Simeon when you bring Benjamin back. And so what happens? Well, the brothers go back. When they get back, they've paid money to get the food. When they get back, they're starting to unload their packs, and what they see is the money is put back in their packs. So they start freaking out. They're like, oh my gosh, we paid for this stuff, but it's in our packs. Joseph's going to think that we stole it. He's going to think that we're terrible people so that they become scared. And they tell Jacob that he wants Benjamin to come back. And Jacob says, I've already lost my favorite son. Benjamin's the second favorite son. He's like, I'm not sending him. Simeon can stay in Egypt. We're going to just hang out here. So that's what happens. 42, they stay there. They don't go back. Chapter 43. Now the famine was severe in the land, and when they had eaten the grain that they bought from Egypt, their father said to them, go again, buy us a little grain. Right? So I need you to go back to Egypt. And then his brother's getting this dialogue again. We told you, Dad, he's not going to give us anything unless we take Benjamin. We got to take Benjamin with us, or he's not going to give us any grain. He thinks we're spies.
Here's what I found.
He thinks we're spies. Siri must have found the grain. He thinks we're spies. He's told us not to come back without our younger brother. He's going to kill Simeon if we go back and we don't take Benjamin with us. So they plead with him, and Judah finally makes this vow that he will take care of him. Okay, so Judah vows to keep him safe. So they go back, and they go back to Egypt. Okay, chapter 44. Joseph tests them again. Okay, so chapter 44, Joseph tests them again. They come back and they're like, hey, when we got there, we had this money, but it wasn't ours. We gave it to you, and Joseph is cool about it. He's like, listen, God put the treasure in your sacks. It wasn't me. I know that it wasn't you. God was taking care of you. And so that's 43. And then 44, he tests them. He sees Benjamin at one point, and he has to leave because he breaks down. He gets so upset because he's seen his brother and that he's okay, and he breaks down. And then they have a feast together. They have a meal together, and Benjamin gets 5 times more than his brothers from the table. And that's in chapter 43. And then 44, Joseph tests his brothers. He sends them out again with the stuff. He fills their sacks with food as much as they can carry, and each one the money in his sack. And then he takes one of his cups, and he puts it in Benjamin's bag to see what will happen. And so they leave, and as they leave, Joseph's men come up, and they said, one of you stole from me. Like, one of you took something from me. And they're like, no, none of us took anything, especially after the whole money deal, like, none of us took anything. And verse 12, it says, and he searched, beginning with the eldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Then they tore their clothes, and every man loaded his donkey, and they returned back to the city. They go back to Egypt. Now, when Judah and his brothers came, this is chapter 44, verse 14. I don't think I put this on the screen. So when Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, he was still there. They fell before him on the ground, and Joseph said to them, what deed is this that you have done? Do you not know that a man like me can indeed practice divination? Right? I'm smart. I can interpret dreams. This should have been a nod for them, right? They had a brother that could interpret them. They don't put 2 and 2 together. And Judah said, what shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's servants. Both we and he also in whose hand the cup has been found. But he said, far be it from me that I should do so. Only the man whose hand the cup was found shall be my servant. But as for you, go up in peace to your father. In other words, I'm going to keep Benjamin. Y'all can go back to your father. And so Judah goes and he pleads. He's like, listen, I put a vow out to my dad that I would take care of Benjamin, that I would bring him back. You can't keep him. Like, it just won't work. And so they begin to plead and plead and plead. The boy cannot leave his father. Verse 22, for if he should leave his father would die. And then he said to your servants, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you will not see my face again. And so he tells them to go back and buy a little food. Verse 30, now therefore, as soon as I come up to your servant, my father, and the boy is not with us, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life, as soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant, our father, with sorrow to Sheol. For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy. Judah's talking about himself. For the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. So Judah pleads with him, and finally Joseph just can't take it, right? The game has gone on long enough. He's kind of not really tortured them, but he's testing them to see if they're better than they were before, right? And what he's seeing is that these are not the same men who threw me into the pit. These are not the same men who sold me into slavery. These are men who care for their brother. They came back for Simeon. They're caring for Benjamin. They've offered their life in replacement of his. So he finally realizes he can trust him. And then at the beginning of chapter 45, he breaks down. He could not control himself. And so he tells everybody to go away. Just get out. I got to rethink this. I got to think through it, right? And he breaks down. And then let's pick up in Genesis chapter 45, verse 4. Actually, go back to 3. Well, 4 is good. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." So the truth comes out. Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers and says, "Listen, I'm Joseph, your brother." And he has humility here, right? He doesn't hold it against them. He says, "Listen, it really wasn't you who put me here. You might have sold me into slavery, but God meant for me to be here so that I could protect the promise that he made to our forefathers. Like, God put me here. Like, you might have sold me into slavery, but it was God who put me here." And so he tells his brothers, he tells them to go back to Israel, go get Jacob, go bring the whole family. We're going to come, and I want you to come and live in Egypt, right? Where you're taken care of. You don't have to go back and forth. You don't have to buy the grain. I want you to come here. Pharaoh finds out that Joseph's family is coming. He sets them up in the land of Goshen, which is like the nicest area in Egypt. Like, it's the country club. It's got the greatest fruit. It's got the greatest vegetables. He puts them there and sets them up. Joseph's family is cared for. They're taken care of. And so Joseph has humility in the midst of all this power, right? He could get revenge on his brothers. He could wipe them out. He could take vengeance for what they had done to him, but he chooses to remain faithful to God because he sees that there's a bigger plan here. And it all kind of gets summed up in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. And you've probably heard this verse before. Joseph says to his brothers, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Joseph had the presence of mind to go, "Listen, what you guys meant for evil, God used it for good. What you meant for evil, God used it for good." So what does all this mean for us? Well, what we see in the life of Joseph is that he is a man of trust. He is a man of integrity. He is a man of patience. And he is a man of humility. All the things that we as Christians should exercise in our daily life. We should be people who trust God, who are held to a higher standard. We're people of integrity. We are patient and trusting in God to work things out for us and for our good, and that we are humble even in the midst of power. We could do whatever we wanted to get our way. But all of us in this room face difficult circumstances, right? Anybody ever had a hard time? Anybody ever had difficult circumstances? At some point in your life, whether you haven't before, you will face difficult circumstances, and you can respond in one of two ways. Number one, you can let your circumstances define you. "Oh, well, I'm in prison. I can't do nothing." "Oh, well, I try to do the right thing, and all these bad things keep happening to me." You can let your circumstances define you, or you can let God define you despite your circumstances. And that's what Joseph does. Like, in spite of his circumstances, he still knows that God has a plan, that God is working something out, and he's trusting in him. So despite what everything looks like around him, he knows the bigger picture, that God is working out a bigger plan. I think it was Charles Spurgeon that said, it's like if you look at a tapestry, like a mosaic, right? If you get right up on it, like, all you see is the threads right in front of your face, right? So there might be this one little red thread that's running through, and that's all you can see because it's right in front of your face. But what happens is when you step back and you can look at the thing as a whole, you see this beautiful picture, this beautiful tapestry that someone has woven together, because now all the pieces come together and it makes sense. We've got to trust that God is weaving together this beautiful tapestry, and even though all we can see is what's right in front of our face, we've got to trust that God is weaving together this beautiful, beautiful picture. And so what happened to Joseph in the pit? Well, when we only look at our present circumstances, we're forgetting the promises of God. Right? God has promised that he will take care of us, that he is faithful to us, right? That he is going to watch out for us as his chosen people, that he will take care of us. What did Joseph do under pressure? Well, he remained and had fellowship with God, even despite being under pressure. He had faithfulness to God, even despite that he was under pressure. And he had fruit in his life that showed that he still trusted God. He didn't give in to temptation. He didn't give in to Potiphar's wife. When he was squeezed, his integrity and his character is what came out. And then Joseph had patience in the prison. You know what's crazy is that prison should be a place of bitterness and depression. Like, I've never been there, but I don't think it would be a fun place to go. Like, is anybody in here like, you know what, I really want to go to prison one day. I think that'd be great. But look at what God can do, even in prison. John Bunyan was in prison for 12 years, and out of that he wrote The Pilgrim's Progress. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German Christian who fought against the Nazis, was placed in prison, and he wrote an amazing book called The Cost of Discipleship. Martin Luther was put into prison for going against the Catholic Church, and while he was there, he translated the entire New Testament into German, into the common language, when at that point in time, it was only the priests who could read it in Latin. Paul wrote many of his letters from where? Prison. John was exiled to prison on Patmos, a deserted island, and he wrote the book of Revelation. So despite being in prison, God can use that to make things happen that are amazing if we would just have patience and trust in him. You see, the secret to victory in traumatic circumstances is to see with your eyes the hand of God in every circumstance. See, we look at the world and we go, God, why are these things happening to me? All we see are the problems instead of seeing them as, what is God doing right now? I know that God is faithful, and I know that he's going to use whatever circumstance I'm going through right now to do something amazing in my life down the road. We have to trust in the hand of God. Trust in God alone, because man will often let us down, as Joseph saw with Potiphar, with the cupbearer, that no matter how good he was to people, they often let him down, but God never did. And then I want to close you with this. In Romans 8:28, it says this. Paul writes, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." I don't know what your circumstances are. I don't know the things you've been through, but I do know this, that God is faithful. And if there's one thing that we can see in the life of Joseph, it's that when you trust God, God will change your circumstances and he will use them for your good. So we can trust in him to be faithful, to be good, because that's what he did for Joseph, and that's what he'll do for us. Would you pray with me? Father, we thank you that Joseph was a man of character, of integrity, that we have his story recorded in your word, that we can learn from it. God, I've never been to prison. I've never been thrown into a pit, but I've been through some rough circumstances. And God, there were oftentimes in the midst of that difficulty that I didn't trust you. And I'm sure there are people here in this room who have felt the same way. But God, over and over and over again, you have proven your faithfulness. You have proven that you will never leave us, that you will never forsake us. And like Paul said in Romans, God, that you are working all things together for our good. We just need to trust you. So I pray for everyone in this room, God, that you would help us to trust you in the midst of difficulty, in the midst of loss, in the midst of horrible circumstances, that we would trust you because you are faithful and you are for our good. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Thank you, guys. Y'all have a good night.